There's a sound that haunts the galaxy, not the roar of bolters or the thunder of orbital fire. No, it's quieter, slower, human. It's the wet, ragged cough of a dying man, a breath that fights to escape rotting lungs, a whisper through a throat full of blood and bile. That is a sound that follows Mortarion, Primarch of the Death Guard. He is called the Lord of Death, the Reaper, the Herald of Decay. But before all that, he was a child choking on poisoned air, before the wings of rot and the scythe of silence, before demonhood and damnation. He was a boy who couldn't breathe, and that's the tragedy. Because Mortarion didn't fall. He endured. He survived the curse he was born into. He made it a weapon. He forged it into armor. And in doing so, he chained himself to it forever. What if the very thing that gave a Primarch his strength was also the thing that damned him? What if his gift was his curse? What if Mortarion never escaped the poison, but simply learned to carry it, spread it, and call it purpose? This is not a story of glory. It's not about brotherhood or conquest. This is a slow death of a soul, the decay of a man who wanted to free the oppressed, but became the very disease he hated. Tonight, we follow that descent. We'll start on Barbarus, a planet choked in toxic fog, where every breath is agony, where Mortarion's life began not with light, but with suffocation. He was raised by monsters. He learned war from tyrants, and he fought to liberate a world he could never truly survive. Then came the Emperor, the Golden God, the savior who didn't need to breathe, who climbed higher than Mortarion ever could, who stole the one victory Mortarion needed to win for himself. That wound never healed. It festered, it rotted, and it whispered. Mortarion built his legion in his image, unbreakable, patient, merciless. The Death Guard didn't seek glory. They didn't charge. They marched through fire, through poison, through death itself. But even that wasn't enough, because the real enemy wasn't the battlefield. It was the bitterness in his chest. The same bitterness that made him reject the Emperor, that led him to Horus, that walked him into the warp. And in the heart of that warp, when the coffin became too much, when his sons were rotting from the inside out, he made a choice. He begged, not to the Emperor, not to hope, but to something worse. Something that would never judge him for choking. Something that would embrace the rot. Nurgle, the god of disease, of plague, of slow, inevitable death. And Mortarion became his son. Wings of filth, flesh of decay. Immortal, but never free. A demon prince of the one thing he spent his whole life fighting. This is the price of endurance. This is the curse that wore a crown. This is the story of Mortarion, the Primarch who never stopped coughing, the son who couldn't breathe, the man who choked on his own curse, and decided the galaxy should choke with him. Stay with me. The breath of death is just beginning. Imagine opening your eyes for the first time, and the air itself tries to kill you. Not blades, not chains, not hunger, but breath. The very act of living, every inhalation, becomes a torture. This was Mortarion's first truth. Not the warmth of sunlight, not the embrace of a mother, not the safety of a cradle. Poison, a miasma so thick it scoured the lungs, so cruel it warped life into grotesque survival. This was Barbarus, the world of Mortarion's birth, a planet shrouded forever in suffocating clouds, where mountains rose higher than the eye could see, and upon those peaks lived overlords in necrotic armor, towering warlords who fed upon the weak in the valleys below. Mortarion's cradle was no cradle at all. He was discovered by one of these overlords, drawn to the crash of the Primarch's capsule upon the poisoned slopes. A child, but not like other children. Already larger, already enduring, already stubbornly alive where any mortal infant would have shriveled to dust. The Overlord claimed him, raised him as a prize, a weapon, and perhaps as something closer to a twisted son. The creature dressed him in armor, schooled him in war, tested his resilience against the poisons of Barbarus. Where other children screamed and withered, Mortarion endured, coughing but never collapsing. The Overlord was amused. Here was a child who could survive in an atmosphere that killed armies. But survival does not mean belonging. Even as a boy, Mortarion's heart was not chained to the warlord who raised him. When he looked down from the mountain peaks, through the clouds, he saw shadows of humanity below. Frail peasants, coughing, struggling, always dying, but always living just long enough to raise children who would cough and struggle again. Mortarion's chest ached not from poison alone, but from recognition. He was not like his adoptive father, no matter how towering or terrible. He was like them, the weak ones, the dying ones, the ones who had no weapons except endurance. That recognition sparked something ancient in him. Hatred. Hatred for the tyrants who hovered in the skies, clad in armor, feeding upon the weak like carrion lords. Hatred for the poison that robbed men of hope. Hatred for the reality that survival itself was agony. And in that hatred, Mortarion found his identity. He began to wander lower into the mists, where his lungs seared worse, but his resolve grew harder. Among the villages of the valley dwellers, he was greeted as both monster and savior, a towering figure, coughing like them, but walking upright when they could not. He saw how they lived. Meager harvest poisoned by the air, children who never reached adulthood, elders who aged into corpses before their prime. They lived under constant raids by the Overlord's thralls, half-dead horrors who carried the mist within their very bodies. Mortarion saw it all and knew he belonged to them, not the tyrants above. And so, as a boy, he made a vow. He would free Barbarus. He would cleanse the poison, slay the Overlords, and bring the valleys into sunlight. A vow born not of idealism, but of fury. Mortarion's heart was not one of hope. It was one of defiance. But fate is cruel. For all his resilience, Mortarion could never climb higher than his father's fortress without collapsing. The higher he went, the thicker the poison grew, until his lungs gave way and he would collapse in a fit of coughing black ichor. He would try again and again, but always fail. That invisible wall became his first true prison. He could fight, he could lead, he could hate, but he could never defeat the very air he breathed. That limitation burned into him, deeper than any scar. Still, Mortarion trained. He grew in stature, towering over the villagers, wielding scythes and crude weapons that felt more natural in his hand than swords. He learned to turn the weakness of men into strength. Ambush patience, the endurance to suffer wounds and yet keep striking. He led the peasant against the thralls of the Overlords, and for the first time, victory came to the valleys. Word spread. A lord had risen, not of the peaks, but of the poisoned ground. A lord of death who coughed as they coughed, but who never fell. Each victory came at cost. The mists claimed lives by the hundreds. Yet Mortarion pressed forward, never sparing himself. His lungs rotted even as his body grew stronger. His cough deepened even as his arms swung harder. Every day was proof of his paradox, that he could endure what should not be endured, but never escape it. And yet, what did he feel? Triumph? No, bitterness. For even as the peasants hailed him, even as he broke the chains of Overlords one by one, he knew there was always another fortress higher in the clouds. Always another tyrant, armored in poison, waiting. Always another reminder that his endurance had a ceiling. He could never go higher. He could never kill the greatest tyrant of them all, his adoptive father, who watched from the highest peak with silent amusement, knowing Mortarion could never reach him. This was the seed of Mortarion's tragedy. He fought not to win, but because he could not stop fighting, because his very existence demanded he strike back, even if he could never strike high enough. Pause here. Picture him in the mists, half man, half giant, coughing blood but still wielding his scythe. Villagers behind him, eyes burning with both hope and terror. He leads them not because he promises victory, but because he is the only one who can keep walking when the air itself says die. He is both their savior and their mirror. They see their own suffering in him, and he shows them how to weaponize it. That is a paradox of Mortarion's childhood. He gave him the strength to endure their curse, but he could never lift the curse itself. And this is what bound his soul forever. For when the Emperor would one day descend, clothed in gold, offering salvation from above, Mortarion would see not a savior, but yet another tyrant, another overlord in shining armor, another figure who could walk higher than he could, breathe air Mortarion could not, when battles Mortarion could not finish. The bitterness planted in Barbarus would never leave him. His childhood was poison, but his manhood would be worse. For a boy who could never escape the mist will become a Primarch who could never escape his curse. And from the very first cough, he was already doomed. Picture it, a world wrapped in endless storms of poison, where the sky itself is a grave. Villages of men and women huddle in the valleys, coughing their lives away, waiting for the next raid from the overlords who descend from the mountains. These lords are not men in truth, but towering warlocks clad in rotting armor, their lungs filled with the same poison that kills mortals, their strength sharpened by centuries of cruelty. For countless generations, they had ruled unchecked. But then came Mortarion, no longer a child, no longer a boy learning at the feet of his twisted adoptive father. He was a giant now, gaunt and pale, but strong beyond measure. He bore scars in his lungs, in his skin, in his soul. Yet he lived. He breathed. He walked through the poison mist where others crawled. And when people looked at him, they saw something impossible. A man who was like them, but one who could stand tall against the overlords. This was the beginning of rebellion. Mortarion, the coughing lord, the giant boar of the mists, took the people's scythes and sickles and taught them war. Their weapons were crude. Their shields were rusted wood. But behind Mortarion's pale figure, something greater than weapons carried them forward. Rage. The rage of peasants who had lost fathers and mothers, children and friends, all claimed by the poison and the raids. Mortarion did not simply fight. He led. He gave shape to their suffering. He turned their coughing into war cries, their weakness into determination. He became what Barbarus had never seen before, a commander forged not by cruelty but by shared pain. And it worked. The peasants began to win. The overlord's thralls, those grotesque half-dead things filled with poison, were torn apart by blades swung by starving men. Mortarion was always at the front, his scythe carving arcs of death, his lungs rattling with each swing. He did not ask his people to suffer what he would not. He carried the heaviest burdens himself. Every battle was a gamble against death, but Mortarion refused to die. His enemies called him a phantom, a figure of death itself come to reap. His followers gave him another name, Lord of Death. And yet it was never enough. For every overlord slain, another fortress loomed higher up the mountain. For every tyrant toppled, another gazed down from the poisoned peaks. Mortarion knew it, even as he tasted victory. He could not reach them all. He could not breathe their air. No matter how high he climbed, no matter how many he killed, the mist would thicken until his body failed him. Always he would collapse, coughing black blood, and be dragged back by his followers. Always, the peaks remained out of reach. This truth gnawed at him like acid. He wanted to free Barbarus, to scour it clean of tyranny and poison. But deep down he knew he was still trapped. The people saw him as a savior, but he felt himself a fraud. How could a savior choke on the same air as his slaves? How could a liberator fail to climb the final steps? His war against the Overlords became endless. It was not war for triumph. It was war for survival, war for defiance. He would not stop, because stopping meant submission. His body grew stronger, his armies larger, but his lungs weaker. The cough never left him. It deepened, thickened, until his very voice carried the sound of death when he spoke to his warriors. His words were ragged, broken by breath, but the people listened because they heard themselves in his voice. He was not a god. He was not untouchable. He was their pain made flesh, and that made him unstoppable. The Overlords began to fear him. For the first time in centuries, they did not descend from their fortresses with impunity. They fortified. They whispered to each other in their necrotic voices. They sent their thralls in waves, hoping to drown him, but the waves broke upon his endurance. Mortarion fought like a man who had nothing left to lose, and his people mirrored him. But the war changed Mortarion too. Each battle hardened his soul, not into hope, but into bitterness. The people worshipped him, but he refused their praise. He saw victory as a lie, because he knew that he could not win the final war. His father, the highest overlord, still watched him from above, amused. Mortarion tried again and again to climb to that fortress, to strike the tyrant down, but always the air betrayed him. He would crawl on hands and knees, his vision blackening, his chest heaving, until at last he collapsed. Each collapse carved bitterness into him like a scar. It told him, "You are strong, but never strong enough. You are free, but never free enough. You are alive, but never alive enough." This was the tragedy of his war. Mortarion was hailed as a liberator, but inside, he felt only failure. His victories were hollow, his triumphs poisoned. He hated the Overlords, but he hated himself just as much, for not being able to breathe what they breathed, for not being able to kill what they were. Still he fought. Still he led. Because what else could he do? He was born in poison. Poison was his blood. Poison was his breath. Even if he could not win, he would never submit. Better to choke forever than bow. Better to march through clouds of death than to live under chains. And so, the legend of Mortarion grew. A giant with hollow eyes, coughing black mist, scythe in hand, leading armies of peasants against nightmare lords. The valleys whispered his name not as prayer, but as defiance. And above, in the poisoned peaks, his father grew restless. Mortarion had become the one thing Barbarus had not known for generations: hope. And hope, in a world of poison, is more dangerous than any weapon. But hope alone could not win him the war. For above the clouds, beyond the reach of his lungs, stood the Overlord he could never defeat, and fate was preparing to send him another challenger, a figure more radiant, more terrible than even his poisoned father, a figure in gold. The day was coming when Mortarion would learn that his war on Barbarus was not the end of his struggle. It was only the beginning of a curse that would follow him across the stars. The air of Barbarus was poison. The peaks were tombs. The valleys were graves waiting to be filled. Mortarion had fought all his life to tear down tyrants who were behind toxic clouds, and still the highest lord remained untouchable. His father, his captor, watched him from the tallest mountain, where no man could climb, where no lungs could draw breath. For Mortarion, every victory had been hollow because the one tyrant he needed to kill still laughed at him from above. He sharpened his scythe. He rallied his peasants. He coughed black bile into the mist. But he could never reach the summit. Until one day, the clouds themselves split open, and something far greater than any overlord descended upon Barbarus. The Emperor had come. Imagine it. Golden light, blazing like a second sun through clouds that had never known warmth. A figure clad in radiant armor, walking through poison as over air, unbothered, untouchable. For the people of Barbarus, this was a god. For Mortarion, it was a nightmare. He had spent his entire life fighting tyrants above the clouds, lords who could breathe where he could not. And now here was the greatest of them all, this shining warlord who strode across the mountains with ease, unchoked, unbowed. To the peasants, he was salvation. To Mortarion, he was just another overlord, draped not in decay, but in perfection. The Emperor spoke of liberation. He saw Mortarion as his son, his lost Primarch. He promised a future beyond Barbarus, a galaxy of conquest and unity. But Mortarion did not hear promises. He heard commands. He heard another master claiming ownership of his people, another tyrant offering salvation that demanded obedience. He had not bled his lungs raw. He had not raised armies from corpses, only to kneel to a stranger in gold. When the Emperor confronted the last High Overlord, Mortarion demanded the right to face him. This was his war, his vengeance. He would climb higher than ever before. He would kill the tyrant who had haunted him since childhood. With his scythe in hand, he marched into the mist, lungs burning, vision narrowing. Each step was agony, but he refused to fall. He could almost see the shadow of his father, massive in the storm, waiting for him at the peak. This was the moment, the final war, but the air betrayed him again. The higher he climbed, the darker the world became. His chest collapsed, his vision swam. Every breath was knives. He staggered, he crawled, but the poison was too thick. His body gave way. The coughs racked him until he could not stand. He fell to his knees, blind, suffocating, scythe slipping from his grip. And then the golden figure stepped past him. The Emperor, untouched, unbothered, strode through the poison as if it were a clear summer breeze. He raised his blade, and with a single strike ended the High Overlord. The tyrant Mortarion had sworn to kill, the enemy who had defined his entire life, died not by Mortarion's hand, but by the hand of the stranger. The battle was stolen, the vengeance denied. Mortarion's entire purpose ripped from him in one effortless act. To the peasants, this was triumph. The Emperor had freed them. The nightmare was over. They cheered. They bowed. They believed they had seen the hand of a god strike down their tormentor. But Mortarion's heart rotted with fury. He had not been freed. He had been robbed. His life's war, his life's meaning, stripped from him in a single golden flash. The Emperor then offered Mortarion a place at his side. He called him son. He promised him the stars. But Mortarion's eyes did not see a father. They saw another tyrant, a tyrant more powerful than any he had ever known. For what is freedom if every breath you take is in another man's shadow? What is victory if it belongs not to you, but to someone stronger? Mortarion obeyed. He had no choice. The Emperor's power was undeniable, his armies vast, his will absolute. Barbarus was claimed for the Imperium. Its people swept into the great machine of the Great Crusade. Mortarion was given command of a legion, the Death Guard, who would mirror his endurance, his bitterness, his strength in poison. Outwardly, he was a loyal son. Inwardly, he was already broken. For Mortarion carried a wound no medicine could heal, the wound of humiliation. He had wanted to be his people's savior. Instead, he had become their commander under someone else's rule. He had wanted to prove that tyranny could be killed by those who suffered beneath it. Instead, he had watched tyranny be slain by a figure who walked above it all. He had wanted freedom. Instead, he was adopted. Picture him then, standing beside the Emperor, clad in pale armor, his legion kneeling before him. To the Imperium, this was triumph. The lost son found, the people of Barbarus liberated. But inside Mortarion's chest, beneath the coughs that never left him, the bitterness festered. He had been denied his final victory. He had been made a child again, in the shadow of a master. And though he obeyed, though he fought for the Emperor's wars, a seed of resentment had been planted deep within him. That seed would grow. It would grow with every command he obeyed, with every battle he fought in the Emperor's name. It would grow each time he saw the golden armor glint, Each time he remembered the moment he collapsed on a mountainside while another man won his war. It would grow until it consumed him, until it strangled him, until it delivered him to the one master who would not take away his curse, but embrace it. The Emperor thought he had claimed another son, but what he had really claimed was a man already poisoned, already broken, already choking on a hatred that would never leave him. And so Mortarion stepped into the Great Crusade, not as a true son, but as a soldier bound in chains of bitterness. His cough echoed still, his lungs rattled still, and his heart whispered one truth. Freedom had been stolen from him once. It would never be given back. They marched like a slow-moving storm. No banners, no war cries, just a steady sound of armored boots crushing ash and bones beneath them, like the world itself was breaking under their weight. That was the Death Guard, relentless, inevitable, and behind their silent wall of ceramite was a man who taught them that to survive was not enough, they had to endure. When Mortarion took command of the 14th Legion, he didn't see heroes. He didn't want champions. He didn't believe in glory. What he saw were tools, and tools needed to be hardened, shaped, and stripped of all weakness. Once, they had been known as the Dusk Raiders, legionaries from Terra's harshest regions, survivors of radiation storms, chemical wastelands, famine. Mortarion saw something familiar in them. These were men who had already suffered before they were warriors. But suffering alone wasn't enough. He would make them impervious, not through pride, not through strength, through pain. He trained them in environments most legions avoided: foul air, dead worlds, plague zones. While others built shining fortresses, Mortarion built them into weapons of attrition. He taught them that war wasn't about victory. It was about outlasting everyone else. Each recruit learned to breathe through filters filled with rot, to walk for days in broken armor, skin blistering beneath, to fire their bolters through choking smoke, blind but steady, not for show, for survival, because in Mortarion's eyes, the galaxy was not a place to conquer, it was a place to endure. He changed their armor. No more polished pauldrons. No bright insignias, just pale, sickly green, like the mist of Barbarus. Their new symbol became a mark of decay, the three-circle fly, a quiet prophecy of what they would become. He reshaped the way they fought. They didn't strike fast. They didn't seek glorious charges. They advanced like rot through a wound, slow, steady, unstoppable. Their tactics wore down enemies over days, weeks, until hope collapsed and resistance suffocated. They became known for holding the line where others broke, on plague worlds, in rad-blasted tunnels, through diseases that melted lungs. The Death Guard marched, step by step, shot by shot, coughing, bleeding, but never stopping. The tools of their trade changed too. Mortarion wasn't interested in pristine weapons. He approved toxic gas shells, corrosion bombs, rad grenades, anything that made breathing the battlefield a nightmare. They weaponized the air, because that was the war Mortarion had always fought. And around him, two figures rose. Kalak Tufan, the first captain, ruthless, brilliant, always whispering that the ends justified the means, that loyalty was a mask, and truth lay deeper. A man who didn't just follow Mortarion's lessons, he believed in them more than Mortarion himself. And then Nathaniel Garro, a man of principle, devotion, faith and duty, even when it cracked the bones beneath his armor. He followed Mortarion with iron will, but never lost his soul. They were opposites. Two halves of a question Mortarion never asked aloud. What does endurance cost you? Then came the Death Shroud, his silent bodyguards, towering figures wrapped in gloom, bearing massive scythes like their gene father. They never spoke. They needed no words. Their presence said everything. Mortarion had become more than commander. He was death incarnate, and he would never be unguarded again. The Death Guard began to earn their reputation across the stars. They reclaimed poison worlds, destroyed bioplagues, stood untouched in viral bombardments. Where others would retreat, they moved forward. They didn't win with speed. They won by never falling. But while the galaxy praised them, Mortarion only grew colder. Each time the Emperor commended him, his resentment deepened, not because he hated recognition, but because every medal, every victory, reminded him that he had not won his own war. The Emperor had stolen that moment, his revenge on Barbarus, and replaced it with service. Mortarion had obeyed, but he had never forgiven. The Great Crusade gave him purpose, but not peace. He fought for an imperium he didn't love. He followed orders from a father he did not trust, and he led sons molded in his image, yet feared what they might become. Still he marched. The Death Guard became legends, unyielding, stoic, feared, even among other legions. They were spoken of with caution. Their silence was unnerving, their presence heavy, their victories quiet, but absolute. But beneath that silence, something else was growing. A crack. It started small. Typhon's whispers. Questions about why they endured for an emperor who never suffered. Why they fought wars that led only to more death. Why they were never allowed to rest. Mortarion did not answer. Not yet. But the cough in his chest, the one that never left him even now in clean air, was still there. A reminder. A rot. And rot spreads. He had forged his sons into survivors. But in doing so, he had taught them to stop feeling, to stop questioning, to obey the rhythm of war and nothing else. He had trained them to survive poison, but he had not trained them to recognize it in their own souls. And now, the real poison was coming, not from the lungs, but from the warp. And when it arrived, the Death Guard would not run. They would stand, they would breathe it in, and they would change, forever. Mortarion stood among his brothers, but he never felt like one of them. Not truly, not fully. While the other Primarchs rallied under the Emperor's banner with pride in their veins and oaths on their lips, Mortarion marched in silence. His loyalty wasn't love. It was obligation. A bitter pact born not from belief, but from stolen vengeance. He had followed the Emperor because he had no choice. The Golden God had slain the High Overlord of Barbarus. The one monster Mortarion was meant to kill with his own hands. That moment should have been his redemption, his final breath of justice. But the Emperor had taken it from him. As easily as he walked through the poison, Mortarion had spent a lifetime learning to survive. So he bowed, he obeyed, but he never forgave. And in that silence, resentment grew. Mortarion despised what the Emperor represented. Power without struggle. Clean air without cost. He called it hypocrisy, even if he never spoke the words aloud. To his brothers, the Emperor was a father. To Mortarion, he was a reminder of weakness, not the Emperor's, but his own. The Great Crusade pushed forward. Worlds fell. Systems bent the knee. And Mortarion played his part. His Death Guard became known across the stars. Unbreakable, unstoppable, merciless. But as they won their wars, Mortarion's gaze always drifted upward, not toward glory, toward the lies hidden in light. He had grown up with death as his only teacher. He knew how to endure pain, how to fight blind, how to lead through fear and fire. But now, he was being told to follow rules written by men who had never tasted poison, to swear oaths to a father who never coughed, and worse, to accept sorcery. Mortarion hated Psykers, not because they were powerful, but because their power came without suffering, warp-born tricks, unnatural shortcuts. He saw in them the same ease he despised in the Emperor, power that didn't cost enough, power that bypassed the slow climb, the breathless war. He allowed Psykers in his legion only because he was ordered to, but he never trusted them, never relied on them. And when Edict of Nicaea came, banning the use of Psykers across the legions, Mortarion didn't argue. He celebrated. In his mind, it was a rare moment of truth, a rejection of the unnatural, a return to strength earned, not conjured. But the hypocrisy didn't end. The Emperor, who had outlawed sorcery, still used powers no human could explain, still walked without armor through the flames of war, still gave visions and commands beyond reason. Mortarion saw it clearly. The Emperor didn't ban sorcery. He just controlled it. And control was the very thing Mortarion had fought against his entire life. He began to drift, not outwardly, not in defiance, but in spirit, in thought, in the space between loyalty and bitterness. He withdrew from war councils, spoke less at conclaves. When other Primarchs debated strategy, Mortarion stood silent, arms folded, eyes narrowed, judging, weighing, always distant. He bonded with few, Ferrus Manus, perhaps for a time, Vulcan rarely, but most others kept their distance. Magnus, especially, the Crimson King with all his psychic glory and warp-fueled intellect, was everything Mortarion despised. They clashed more than once. Words sharpened into warnings. Respect twisted into quiet loathing. To Mortarion, the warp was not a realm of potential. It was corruption, a lie wearing a mask of light, a trap disguised as power. But the more he tried to avoid it, the more it crept into the corners of his life. He began to feel it around him, soft whispers at the edge of hearing, shadows that slithered behind the fog. He told himself it was nothing, that it was simply his hatred echoing back at him. But deep down he knew something had started to follow him, and the worst part, it understood him, because unlike the Emperor, it didn't ask him to rise above the poison. It promised to make him stronger within it. The warp didn't judge him for coughing. It listened, and in those long, sleepless nights, when his lungs ached and his mind wandered, Mortarion began to listen back. He told himself it was only bitterness, that his loyalty was still intact, that his anger was justified, not dangerous. But resentment is not passive. It festers. It corrupts. And Mortarion, who had survived every poison the galaxy threw at him, was starting to choke on one that came from within. It began the way all poisons do, not with fire, but with a whisper, not with a wound, but with a breath. Mortarion had endured Barbarus. He had endured the Great Crusade. He had endured the humiliation of serving a father he did not love. But endurance has limits, even for a Primarch. And it was in those silent, unguarded moments, the hours between wars, the nights when coughing in his chest rattled too loudly, that the whispers came. At first, he thought it was memory, the echo of Barbarus, the hiss of fog, the voice of his father taunting him from the mountain peaks. But memory does not grow louder. Memory does not answer you when you curse it. These whispers did. They came in the same rhythm as his breathing. Inhale, promises. Exhale, acceptance. They told him what he had always believed, that the Emperor was a tyrant cloaked in light, that his brothers were blind fools, that the Imperial was not salvation, but another prison. And they told him something more, that the poison he hated, the air that had always betrayed him, was not his enemy, it was his inheritance. Mortarion recoiled at the thought. He had spent his life fighting poison, He had built his legion on resisting it. How could it be anything but the enemy? But the Whispers were patient. They did not force. They offered. They told him that what he had always called weakness was strength, that his cough was not shame, it was proof of survival, that endurance was not merely resistance, it was mastery. And in time, Mortarion began to listen. He did not know it then, but these whispers were not merely his bitterness-made voice. They were the murmur of something vast, ancient, and inevitable, the laughter of a god whose throne was not built on lightning or fire, but on decay. Nurgle, the lord of pestilence, the master of rot, the great corrupter. Unlike the emperor, Nurgle did not stand above Mortarion. He did not walk through poison untouched. He breathed it with him. Unlike the emperor, Nurgle did not ask him to rise beyond pain. He told him pain was home. Unlike the emperor, Nurgle did not demand purity. He promised acceptance. Mortarion's hatred had always been aimed at sorcery, at the warp, at things unseen. And yet, the great irony, the one he could never escape, was that the more he hated it, the deeper he sank into it. Because what is hatred if not obsession? What is denial if not fixation? He had tried to escape the poison his whole life, but poison was all he had ever known. He saw it in his legion too. The Death Guard endured what no other could. They walked through gas clouds, through spore storms, through viral bombardments. They held ground where others fled, stood firm where others fell. They had made poison their weapon, just as their Primarch had. They were his mirror, and yet they coughed. Their filters corroded. Their armor stank of toxins. Their skin grew pale. The rot was already creeping in. Mortarion did not stop it. He called it strength. He called it resilience. But deep down he knew they were changing. And in the stillness of his own thoughts, he asked a question he had never dared speak aloud. What if this was always my fate? The warp answered, not with condemnation, not with shame, but with affection, with promises of release, with the voice of a father who would never take away his poison, who would never demand he rise above it, who would never humiliate him with perfection, a father who would tell him, "You were never meant to escape, you were meant to spread." Mortarion told himself he was imagining it, that it was weakness, that he would never kneel to the warp. But every breath betrayed him. Every cough was a reminder that he was already infected, that his soul had already inhaled something he could not cough out. And so the Lord of Death kept marching, pretending he was untouched, pretending he was free. But the truth was already written in his lungs. The poison was not just in the air anymore. It was in him. And soon it would take everything. There's a moment in every tragedy when the path turns. Not suddenly, not with a roar, but with a quiet step that feels almost inevitable. For Mortarion, that step came with Horus. The War Master was beloved by many of his brothers. He shone not with the blinding authority of the Emperor, but with the warmth of camaraderie. He spoke not in decrees, but in confidences. To Mortarion, that difference mattered. For the first time since Barbarus, he found a voice that didn't speak down to him, but to him. When Horus whispered that the Emperor was a tyrant, Mortarion did not argue. He had known it all along. He had lived that truth on the mountain, choking while his father walked untouched. When Horus painted rebellion not as treachery, but as liberation, Mortarion didn't feel shame. He felt recognition. It was easy for him to believe. Too easy. The Death Guard had already been molded into the Legion of Endurance. Silent, obedient, unquestioning. They followed their Primarch's will. And Mortarion's will was bitter. He had always obeyed orders from the Emperor, but with resentment gnawing in his chest. When Horus offered another cause, another master, one who promised freedom from hypocrisy, Mortarion's bitterness bloomed into resolve. He told himself it was not rebellion, it was justice. But justice has sharp teeth. The Horus Heresy erupted. Brother turned on brother, legion on legion. The galaxy burned. And Mortarion, once silent, now found his voice, not raised in loyalty to Terra, but in defiance against it. His death guard marched alongside Horus, unyielding as ever, but now their silence fell heavier, not the silence of patience, the silence of betrayal. Mortarion told himself he was doing the right thing, that the Emperor had lied to them all, that he was no better than the Overlords of Barbarus, that he had taken Mortarion's vengeance, stolen his destiny, enslaved him in golden chains. Horus offered him release. Horus offered him truth. But Mortarion was blind to the deeper poison seeping into his legion, blind to the whispers that had never truly left him, blind to the way his first captain, Kala Typhon, lingered in shadows darker than Horus himself. Mortarion hated sorcery. He rejected the warp. He spat on demons and witches. Yet he walked straight into their arms, convinced he was still clean. That was his pride, his fatal mistake. He thought his hatred was armor. He thought his bitterness was protection. But in truth, there were doors left open. Doors the warp knew how to step through. The Death Guard fought savagely in the Heresy. They became the hammer of Horus' will, breaking world after world with their relentless advance. Attrition, endurance, decay. They did not burn bright like the sons of Horus, or roar with zeal like the word-bearers. They smothered, they strangled, they choked, and in every victory, Mortarion grew more certain. The Emperor was a liar. Horus was the truth. The galaxy would be freed, not by clean light, but by poison endurance. Yet freedom is never free, and justice, when poisoned by pride, curdles into something darker. The path Mortarion chose would not liberate him. It would trap him forever. Because when the Heresy reached its peak, when Horus marched on Terra, when the Death Guard sailed into the warp to bring ruin to the Emperor's throne, Mortarion would discover that betrayal has a price, and his would be paid not with his blade, but with his lungs. He thought he was turning against a tyrant, but in truth, he was walking into the embrace of a new master, one who had been whispering all along, one who would not steal his poison, but crown him with it. And in the warp, aboard his flagship, Mortarion would finally learn what it truly meant to choke. The Death Guard entered the warp as warriors. They emerged as something else. It began on a long voyage toward Terra, when Horus sent Mortarion and his legion into the Immaterium on a campaign of terror. At first, it was nothing unusual, just another translation into the shifting madness of the warp. Mortarion hated it, as he always had. The warp storms pressed like a hand on his chest, foul and unnatural. He clenched his jaw, told himself endurance would see them through. That was always the answer. Endure. But this time, endurance was not enough. The storm thickened around them. Days blurred into weeks, then weeks into months. Time stretched like a wound that would not close. The navigators lost their way. Star charts twisted. The fleet wandered deeper and deeper, lost in currents no mortal could master. And then the sickness came. At first, it was small. A cough, a fever, a weight in the chest. The Death Guard had marched through plagues before. They scoffed at disease. Their lungs had tasted poison on 100 worlds. They believed themselves immune. But this was different. The Destroyer Plague. A sickness with no cure. No respite. No mercy. It spread ship by ship, chamber by chamber. A creeping, choking rot. Warriors who had stood unbroken in toxic storms now fell to their knees, clutching their throats, vomiting blood and bile. Ceramite armor corroded. Bolters rusted. The decks themselves seemed to sweat with filth. Mortarion felt it worst of all. His body, a Primarch's body, should have been proof against any ailment, but the destroyer plague sank into him, deeper than poison, deeper than any wound he had ever suffered. His cough became a death rattle. His strength faltered. For the first time since childhood, Mortarion tasted fear. The Death Guard begged for relief. Warriors who had once laughed at death now prayed for it. The air stank of rot. Men drowned in their own lungs. The fleet became a flotilla of floating tombs. And Mortarion, Lord of Death, could do nothing. He raged. He cursed. He tried to command his sons to stand, to endure, but endurance had limits. He watched them rot before his eyes, their flesh sloughing from bone, their armor becoming coffins of pus and decay. And all the while, his own body betrayed him. Every breath was agony. Every heartbeat felt stolen. That was when the whispers returned. Not faint now, not distant. They filled the ships like a second atmosphere. They spoke in tones both mocking and tender. They called him child. They called him son. They told him he did not need to fight the poison. He only needed to embrace it. Mortarion resisted. He screamed that he would never bow to sorcery, never kneel to demons, never submit to lies. But the cough shook his words apart. His voice was drowned in blood. He had nothing left to offer but denial. And then came Typhon, Typhon, his first captain. Loyal, trusted, and rotten to the core. Typhon had always whispered darker truths, always walked too comfortably in shadow. Now he revealed the final betrayal. It was he who had guided them into the storm, he who had silenced the navigators, he who had delivered them into the waiting hands of something vast and hungry. Typhon offered him a choice. Not victory, not freedom, survival. Mortarion spat at it. He said he would rather die than kneel, but his sons were already dying. Their screams echoed through the plague ships, a chorus of despair. Warriors who had endured every horror the galaxy could offer now begged their father to save them, and Mortarion could not. So he yielded, on the edge of death, choking on his own curse. Mortarion made the bargain he swore he never would. He offered himself, his sons, his legion, everything, to the voice in the mists. The bargain was accepted, and the Death Guard were reborn. Armor fused to rotting flesh. Helmets became faces of decay. Lungs no longer coughed blood. They breathed corruption. They no longer marched as men. They shuffled as plagues given form. The destroyer plague did not kill them. It remade them. And Mortarion himself changed. His skin split. His bones stretched. Filth poured from his lungs and became wings of rot. His side grew heavier, darker, its blade dripping with rust and corruption. His eyes became hollow pits of despair. He was no longer a man, no longer a Primarch. He was a demon. The Lord of Death had finally died, and what rose in his place was Nurgle's chosen son. The transformation was not a single moment. It was not a flash of light, not a coronation. It was a slow drowning, like a man slipping into a swamp, each breath heavier than the last, until breath itself is no longer needed. That was Mortarion's rebirth. When the bargain was sealed, the destroyer plague did not stop. It blossomed. It ate his humanity piece by piece. But instead of killing him, it twisted him into something enduring. The pain that had always haunted his lungs was no longer a wound. It was his nature. He did not breathe air anymore. He breathed corruption. His body grew vast. His once gaunt frame stretched and warped into a silhouette that was no longer human. Wings, enormous and rotting, sprouted from his back. Wet and tattered things that leaked spores and mist wherever they beat. His armor fused with his flesh, corroded ceramite becoming diseased skin. cracked plates turning into bone. Pipes and vents jutted from his body like tumors, releasing clouds of pestilence. His scythe, silence, lengthened into a monstrous weapon, its blade jagged with rust, etched with the blessing of filth. Where once his voice was broken by coughing, now it carried like a rasp of rusted iron, thick with phlegm and power. He was no longer a prisoner of poison. He was poison incarnate. This was the final irony. Mortarion had despised sorcery his whole life. He had sworn to resist the warp, to reject demons, to fight against the unseen. And yet here he stood, no longer mortal, no longer free, reborn as a demon prince of chaos. His hatred of sorcery had not saved him. It had chained him. It had blinded him until the very thing he loathed consumed him. The Death Guard, too, were remade. Where once they were men in armor, they were now plagues in flesh. Their lungs no longer struggled. They exhaled contagion. Their armor was alive, bloated and sweating with disease. Their steps left rot where they walked. They were no longer a legion of endurance. They were a legion of infection. Each warrior a vessel of pestilence. Each ship a floating hive of disease. The Death Guard had become the Plague Marines, the chosen instruments of Nurgle's love. And Nurgle's love was a chain. Mortarion was taken into the garden of Nurgle, that grotesque realm within the warp where blossoms of rock grew taller than mountains, where rivers ran thick with pus, where every leaf was a sore, every tree a wound, every breeze a cloud of spores. There, Mortarion was not a Primarch. He was a son, a favored child. The god of decay held him in affection, warm, suffocating, unyielding. It was not the love of the Emperor, who demanded perfection. It was not the indifference of his false father on Barbarus. This was different. This was possession disguised as kindness. Nurgle did not demand that Mortarion rise above his curse. He told him that his curse was beautiful, that his cough was a hymn, that his suffering was a gift. And Mortarion, broken and remade, could no longer deny it. He had spent his life hating poison, but now he spread it willingly. He had fled decay, but now he wore it as armor. He had cursed every breath of Barbarus, but now his very breath killed worlds. This was the apotheosis of decay. Mortarion did not think of it as victory. Victory had always been a lie to him. He thought of it as inevitability. He was no longer fighting against the poison. He had accepted that it was all he was, all he ever would be. And in that acceptance, he was eternal. The galaxy came to know this new form. When Mortarion descended upon a world, the air itself turned against its people. Fields blackened, rivers soured. The sky is filled with spores and ash. Children coughed before they cried. The Death Guard marched, not as soldiers of flesh and blood, but as heralds of slow death. And Mortarion led them, his wings blotting out the sun, his scythe reaping not just lives but entire civilizations. No enemy could outrun him. For how do you outrun air? No army could kill him. For how do you kill inevitability? Mortarion had become more than a warlord. He was decay given purpose. He was a living proof that rot always wins. That endurance, taken to its end, is not survival, but surrender. And so the Primarch who once dreamed of freeing his people from tyrants became the eternal slave of the most patient tyrant of all. Not a tyrant of chains or armies or laws. A tyrant of nature, of time, of the truth that everything rots. The boy who choked on his first breath of poison had grown into a god who could choke the galaxy itself. But even as he spread his pestilence, even as he carved his place in the long war, Mortarion never escaped that one echo in his lungs. The cough never left him. It was there in Barbarus. It was there in the Great Crusade. It was there in the warp. Because deep down, demon or not, Mortarion had never stopped being what he always was, a man who couldn't breathe. Imagine a place where the air is thick with buzzing wings, where blossoms drip with pus, where the ground is soft with rot beneath your feet. Rivers flow not with water but with filth, and every leaf on every tree is a sore weeping poison. This is not a battlefield. This is not even a nightmare. This is a garden of Nurgle, the realm within the warp where decay itself blooms eternal. And this became Mortarion's new home. When he bent the knee, when the destroyer plague broke him and his sons, when he traded vengeance for survival, Mortarion was carried into this grotesque paradise. At first, he fought it. He hated it. The stench, the buzzing, the endless damp. It reminded him too much of Barbarus, too much of the prison of his youth. He had traded one world of poison for another, but this was different. Barbarus had been cruelty without mercy. The garden was cruelty with affection. Its master did not rule with chains of iron. He ruled with chains of love. Nurgle greeted him not as a prisoner, but as a son. The gods' booming laughter filled the festering air, shaking the swollen trees. His flies landed on Mortarion's wings. His swords dripped across Mortarion's armor, and he whispered words no tyrant on Barbarus had ever spoken. You are perfect, just as you are. This was the trap. The Emperor had demanded perfection. His adoptive father on Barbarus had demanded obedience. Nurgle demanded nothing but acceptance. He did not ask Mortarion to resist the poison. He told him to embrace it. He did not tell him to fight Decay. He told him Decay was beautiful. Mortarion despised sorcery. He despised the warp. He despised chains. And yet, he found himself bound tighter than ever before, not by force, but by suffocating affection. For what is harder to resist? The lash of a tyrant, or the embrace of a father who whispers that you are finally enough? Mortarion tried to deny it. He called Nurgle a captor. He told himself he was only enduring, as he always had. But the truth seeped in. The cough in his chest no longer hurt. It became a hymn. The mist that had once burned his lungs now filled him with strength. The plague that had nearly killed his legion now made him immortal. The garden reshaped him. He walked its paths, wings dripping spores, his scythe cutting down stalks that bled yellow ichor instead of sap. He wandered among the demon flowers, blossoms that croaked with laughter, vines that reached out to caress him like children clinging to a parent. Everywhere, he heard the laughter of Grandfather Nurgle, a laughter not mocking, but warm, rolling, endless. It was joy without light, happiness without health. It was the kind of love that smothered, and Mortarion could not escape it, even as he led wars in the material realm, even as he spread rot across the stars. Part of him always remained in the garden, always chained to its festering paradise, because that is what Nurgle's gift truly was, not freedom, but belonging, a belonging Mortarion had never known, not on Barbarus, not with the Emperor, not even with his brothers. Only here, in this wild parody of life, was he wanted without condition. And yet, Mortarion hated it. He hated the way the garden reminded him of everything he had fought against. He hated the buzzing flies that followed him like praises. He hated the way his body, once gaunt and sharp, was now bloated with unnatural endurance, his every breath a cloud of contagion. He hated the way Nurgle called him son in a voice that made the warp tremble with delight. But he could not tear himself away, because for all his hate, Mortarion had never been free. Not once, not ever. Barbarus had chained his lungs. The Emperor had chained his soul. And now Nurgle chained his heart with love. Love twisted into slavery. Laughter warped into prison bars. He was not a general anymore. He was a gardener's tool. The Death Guard, too, became flowers in this garden. They roamed the mortal galaxy, but their roots were here. They spread spores of corruption, seeding every battlefield with fragments of Nurgle's paradise. Every world they conquered became an echo of the garden, a place where crops rotted in the field, where children cough in their cradles, where cities drown in slime. Mortarion had wanted to free his people from poison. Instead, he had given poison to everyone. And Nurgle was proud. The god of Decay did not curse him for his contradictions. He laughed at them. He delighted in the irony. He told Mortarion that his journey had never been a fall. It was a blooming, that the child on Barbarus who choked on poison had not been cursed, but chosen, that all the suffering, all the bitterness, all the hatred had been necessary steps toward this. Mortarion never bowed willingly, but in Nurgle's eyes, he didn't need to. Submission wasn't required. Presence was enough. The fact that he lived, that he breathed, that he spread decay, that was devotion, whether Mortarion admitted it or not. That is the cruelest truth of Mortarion's existence. He is not chained by force. He is chained by inevitability. By love he cannot return. By laughter he cannot silence. By a god who does not demand worship, only endurance. And Mortarion has always endured. He walks the garden still, when the wars are done, among the buzzing flies, beneath the dripping trees, a pale shadow with hollow eyes, coughing not in pain, but in rhythm with the laughter of his god. He hates it. He will always hate it, but he cannot leave. He cannot escape. He never could. Barbarus was only the beginning. The garden is forever. "10,000 years have passed since Mortarion gave his soul away, and still his breath lingers on the galaxy. The cough of Barbarus became the cough of the Imperium. Entire systems wheeze under the shadow of his fleets. Their skies thick with the same poison clouds that once tormented a lonely child in the valleys of his home world. Mortarion has not conquered the galaxy. He has infected it. He walks now as a demon prince, towering skeletal, wings dripping with decay, his sides silence reaping through cities like harvest fields. He is no longer a warlord bound by human limits. He is a plague-given form. To look upon him is to see the inevitability of death. Where Mortarion treads, the soil blackens, rivers clot, stars themselves seem dimmer beneath his rot. And yet, for all his power, the irony is cruel. He is no freer than a coughing boy on Barbarus. Once, he was chained to his false father, gasping on the mountain slopes. Then he was chained to the Emperor, robbed of his vengeance. Now he is chained to Nurgle, the god who calls him son, who whispers with suffocating love. A love Mortarion despises but cannot escape. Because Nurgle does not rule with a whip. He rules with affection. He gives Mortarion the thing the Emperor never did, acceptance. Nurgle does not ask him to rise above poison. He tells him to embrace it, to spread it, to share it with every living thing. That is the cruelest chain of all. Not obedience through fear, but obedience through a twisted, suffocating comfort. And Mortarion hates it. He despises Nurgle as much as he despised the Emperor. But it no longer matters. Hate cannot break chains when those chains are woven into your flesh, your lungs, your very breath. Mortarion is not free. He never was. In the 41st millennium, the Death Guard march as they always did, steady, relentless, unstoppable. Their armor seeps with filth. Their bolters spit contagion. Their very presence rots the ground beneath them. They are not soldiers anymore. They are symptoms. Each Death Guard a walking infection. Each fleet a plague given momentum. Worlds do not fall to them in glory. Worlds suffocate, and at their head is a pale figure with hollow eyes and rotting wings, coughing not with weakness but with eternity. Mortarion does not roar like Angron. He does not scheme like Lorgar. He does not blaze like Magnus. He is slower, quieter, more inevitable. He advances with the patience of decay itself, because he knows the truth. You cannot fight rot. You can only delay it. That is why Mortarion is feared not just as a Primarch, but as a symbol. He is a reminder that all things die, that empires crumble, that even gods in time will wither. He is the breath in the dark that says, you can endure, but you cannot escape. On Terra itself, Guilliman has seen him return in war, leading his diseased hordes against the Imperium that once called him brother. And though Guilliman still stands, though the Emperor still sits upon the golden throne, Mortarion knows something they dare not admit. The Imperium is already rotting. Its lungs are already filled with poison, its breath already ragged. He need only wait. And so Mortarion lingers in the galaxy like the final exhale of a dying man. He is not victory. He is not triumph. He is inevitability. The Primarch who never escaped his curse, who never truly breathed freely, who turned his wound into a weapon and spread it across creation. Listen closely and you will hear him, not in the thunder of battle, not in the roar of engines, in the silence that follows, in the ragged breath of a world gasping its last, in the cough that cannot be cured. Mortarion's story was never about conquering. It was about choking. A boy who inhaled poison, a man who spread it, a demon who became it. He fought tyrants, but became the slave of decay. He rejected sorcery, but became its embodiment. He hated his curse, but made it eternal. The galaxy calls him the Lord of Death, the Reaper, the Demon Primarch of Nurgle. But strip away the titles, and the truth is simpler. Mortarion was, and always will be, the Primarch who choked on his own curse. And now, he has ensured that all of us will choke with him. Because, in the end, it was never Mortarion who suffocated. It was the galaxy.